Welcome to the What's Lacking podcast. It's your host, Larry Atencia. With me today is Zack Ramicone. How old are you and where are you from, Zack?
I'm 31 as of May of this year. Just entered my prime, I like to say. Spent most of my formative years in the Bay Area of California, East Bay, home of Mac Dre and other artists.
Another luminaries. My Bay Area friends hate that I hate E40, but I don't hate them as much as I once did. But yeah, I think E40 is a pretty overrated Bay Area rapper.
I agree with that
Oh,
assessment. I like how involved in the East Bay community he is. I like that, and I don't listen to his music.
this is why we get along. This is why we get along. What do you do for a living?
For a living, I'm currently a speech therapist. I'm doing that part time while I build my own business, doing coaching people on how to make communication, interpersonal communication, less stressful, cutting through the noise to reconnect to what people really want and need to communicate, and facilitating that in their relationships so that hard conversations are feel more like quality time.
And I'll put a link to your information just because, yeah, I think you're doing really great work.
Thanks.
We've had really good, deep conversations about what that entails, what that means, and I'm looking forward to seeing the journey that you're headed down.
Yeah, speaking of the complexity of life, it's so exciting, and I get to share this with so many people and really grow it from the ground up. And growing it from the ground up, I'm just constantly confronted with things I don't know that I have to figure out. And the excitement of it is one edge of the sword, and the other edge of the sword is the artificial pressure and urgency I put on myself to have it all figured out right now.
You don't need to, and it seems like you have a plan, and consistency is really important. So as long as
Yeah,
you
man.
keep that in perspective, I think you should be okay. But it's always good when most of the pressure that's being placed on a person is by themselves. Always great when you're your biggest critic, as long as it doesn't move into self defeat and self depreciation.
100%, man. Yeah, I've struggled with that, and that's a big part of the motivation for the work that I do in the first place.
What's your relationship status?
I am in a committed relationship with my wonderful partner. She's in the other room. We live together. We just moved in together March 1st. Yeah, it's been great living together. I mean, I knew pretty shortly after meeting that person good things were coming. Fell in love super quick, and it just felt natural to move in together.
How's that going? Aside from sharing space with the person you love, how about the practical, logistical aspects of it? I always find that interesting, just having to live with someone as just another human being with maybe different ideas about cleanliness, arrangements, how to order things, where the pots and pans should go, or, how quickly should one wash the dishes as opposed to, how comfortable one is to just leave it there. How's that going?
That's such a good question, man, because it's like this nitty-gritty stuff that you don't necessarily think about. We're in love and we want to move in together, so we just do that, right? And then you gotta then you're confronted with all of that and you gotta sort it out piece by piece. And I think we were dating for about a year already before we moved in together, and so we had established a very open and honest platform of communication so that when we did confront that stuff, it's not as if it wasn't uncomfortable, right? Where she's like, hey, this, and this haven't been done in like a while, and I'm tired of being the one to have to do it. And I'm like, wow, yeah, I get it. That's that's uncomfortable, and I think we sorted through that stuff pretty healthily, man. I'm proud of us for both confronting that directly, just sitting down and having those conversations rather than like avoiding it. A lot of people, myself, my very recent self included, would assume that it's not safe to have that conversation based on past experience where those conversations just blow up or people start blaming and shaming each other and stuff, right? So I'm proud of us for just sitting down and having those conversations and being able to talk through it in a way that isn't like, you need to do this and super like rigid expectations. I think logistically speaking, there were two things that came up, one of which was actually like who's doing what chores and when. how often, because both of us are okay letting the dishes sit for a day, and then it's like, ooh, they've been sitting for a day, you know? So both of us are aligned in that sense, but she hates doing the dishes. So I'm like, no, I'll take care of that. That's no problem for me. And I hate doing the cat litter. So she'll take care of that. And it's a pretty even split that way. The thing that was maybe a little more challenging to sort out was that I've been putting a lot of effort into organizing my sleep schedule lately. My New Year's resolution for 2024 was to just figure out how to sleep, man, because it's something that I've always struggled with. So me having to really like set boundaries with myself and communicate that to her, like I'm going to be in bed by 9:30. I'm going to sit there with the lamp on and read for a while, and I'm lights out by 10 p.m. and I'm going to wake up at 6 a.m. and that's just has to be how it is at least 5 days a week for me to gain the consistency that I need. This is really important to me, and it's gonna be weird and it might disrupt some things. So that was an adjustment where we had spent a lot of time together, staying up till 12, 1, 2 on a Tuesday just because we were having fun. And so there's a little bit of, are we sacrificing quality time? And a little bit of FOMO pops up. Thankfully, we just kind of trial and errored that together. So that's pretty well set now. I still have to remind myself and like be very conscious about setting those boundaries with myself because structure and consistency is a pretty new development in my life. So
Yeah.
it's something that it's going to be an ongoing conversation too, because she's starting a new job in September, which will have her like commuting and working some weird hours. She's a physician assistant, so the medical field, their schedules are pretty brutal, right? So we get to revisit that conversation all over again.
I've been really big about my sleep schedule as well. And that's
Mm,
actually my time too, which is 10 p.m. to 6
mm.
a.m. But 10 p.m., 6 a.m., 8 hours in has been a game changer. I think we don't understand just the health effects that getting a good night's sleep can have. There's a lot of just sacrifice of performance, cognitive abilities, physical abilities when you're not sleeping well. And I think it's a big thing that's pretty simple to just incorporate into one's habits and life structure that could have an outsized impact on how well one can perform and be in the world. So, sometimes you might not spend the time that you previously did with your partner, but the ability for you to be present when you are well rested and have slept is so much greater and so much better. So it's a trade-off, but I think ultimately just making sure that you get the sleep in has more beneficial impact.
And I think the trading the quantity of awake time for quality of awake time translates most importantly to all of your relationships and human interactions, because those are the things that require the most presence from us, right? But also to just the quality of work that I'm able to do, both in the things that I'm super motivated to do, like develop content for my business and create, learn how to automate emails and stuff like that, and in stuff that I'm not so motivated to do, like all of the logistics behind the scenes of that stuff, or like during the school year, grinding out IEPs and following up with parents yet again. When I was sloppy with my sleep schedule and get lucky to get 6 hours a night, I thought I was maximizing my productivity, but it was much more difficult for me to grind through the stuff that doesn't have inherent motivation in it, and my gas tank for when I was really in a flow state was depleted. So it's just a win-win.
Do you have any children?
Nope. I've got two cats. They're pretty needy. So
Not as needy as dogs, but needy
definitely.
nonetheless, right? Is having children in your future plans?
I think so, man. Yeah. I think at a certain point I was questioning that. Post-divorce, I was in a place where that was a very active question in my life. And I think parenthood is in my future. I think that as much as I want to contribute to the world through the work that I'm doing and through my presence with all the people in my life, I think contributing 1 to 3 excellent humans to the world is another thing that I would like to do.
Do you mind sharing why post divorce you had a question whether or not you wanted to have children, or
That's
too
a really
personal?
good question. No, man, I appreciate that question. I haven't thought about it in a while. I get to sort of revisit that, which is nice, and reflect on it. I think I had spent the first 27 years of my life, especially the 9 years that I was in that relationship, and the last 3 or 4 of them, perhaps maximally, confined to this very narrow notion of what a good life is, and it was mostly defined by other people's expectations and what kind of life they wanted for me. So post-divorce, after a couple of months of grief, I realized that what I had been grieving was the life I could have been living the whole time, the control I could have had over my own life that whole time. And so I really leaned into that and was actively exploring these questions with just the new perspective of my perspective only. Like trying to weed out all of the other pre-programmed expectations, all of this like Disney-fied view of what a good life is, and all of my family's fairly traditional expectations for how I should be living my life. And it was all very formulaic. And so I set the intention to really explore that for myself. And that newfound freedom was like revelatory for me. There were maybe 2 years of my life where the question of whether or not to have kids well, I was like, maybe not, because I can, with this newfound freedom, I can go anywhere and I can do anything. And starting a family does tie one down, as I'm sure you know. And I was really terrified of that until pretty recently, I think. I still value that freedom and the self-leadership of setting my own expectations and knowing the difference between what I want from life and what other people want from me. Still value those things very deeply, and I think that the challenge, speaking of consistency and structure and the presence, all of that required by having a family, I sort of intuitively get the sense that I'm going to get as much from that as I give into it, and just a new type of experience to have. The basis of that freedom for me was I can have so many experiences, and I went and had plenty of experiences, and now I'm kind of like, okay, I think the long haul, the long con, you could say,
Mm-hmm.
the consistent present dedication to nurturing a small handful of relationships is an experience that I want to seek.
Well said. I had the same sort of trajectory and making a decision to have children, settle down, etc. So yeah, there's tension between autonomy, independence, freedom, this sort of masculine energy of, just being a rolling stone and living life on your own terms, absolutely. And the other more feminine energy of just settling down and building something, cohabitating, being domesticated literally, and the sort of benefits that come with that, building something for the long haul, having that stability, consistency, having someone who is going to fully, deeply, truly get to know you, accept you for who you are, and then you also giving that energy and fully yourself to, like you were saying, raising and building a life project. I have friends who are dear to my heart who have made the decision to not settle down and to live life without that metaphorical anchor. And I think that's the right decision for them because that's the trade-off that they've chosen. And I have other dear friends who I also respect who've made the decision to have a family and to be family men. And there is no right answer. You just need to come up with the decision for yourself and determine what best fits you, what you want from life.
Yeah, man, I think the impulse to build is very natural. And I think that is, as you mentioned, comes from a very masculine energy. And of course, thankfully, we're empowering plenty of women to like lean into that masculine build
Right.
something kind of energy. And there's a very natural trajectory for men. Not that I have any real data on this. This is more anecdotal, my own experience and vibing with a bunch of other men that I know, including you, it turns out, where you're just trying to figure out what you want to build. And that's where that sort of exploratory, really leaning into the autonomy and freedom phase informs, okay, as long as I'm intentional about that and don't get caught in the hedonic treadmill of, oh, I'm so free and I can do whatever I want, which I was very close to doing. I think you get to gather intentional data as you're having those experiences about what kind of life you actually want to build, and then you get to quote unquote settle down. Although I don't like framing it that way because it's
Mm,
just choosing a new journey that's a bit more
mm.
stable.
I like that. Yeah, the connotations and associations we have with the term settling down might not be what we actually experience and the sort of beauty of it. So yeah, I agree with you. Shifting a bit, what was your
Mm.
relationship with your parents like growing up?
Straight into the juicy stuff. I like it. So my parents are, I didn't realize until later, until I went to Berkeley, how conservative my parents were. And it's something like libertarian adjacent. It's got a little bit of complexity to it where there's like some very hardline Republican stuff going on, Second Amendment, close the borders, America first, etc. And I remember my parents saying numerous times growing up, what happens between two consenting adults behind closed doors is no one else's business. So this very like pro, I remember in California, Prop 8 was, I don't know when this, maybe 2008, 2009, something like that. Prop 8 was a big deal because it was going to legalize gay marriage. And my parents, even having voted Republican their entire lives, were like, yeah, Prop 8, let's, like, why can't gay people get married, you know? So in terms of my relationship with them, because I'm sure we'll get back to politics at some point, but
We
that
will.
affected my relationship with them because, as I mentioned before, these like pretty rigid expectations they have for how one should live life and how to be. They both came from middle class families and sort of squandered what little wealth and opportunity they had to force themselves into the situation of having to work from the ground up. And I think that whole process of being almost destitute and working their way back into the middle class spanned my early life. So my earliest memories are actually from living in a trailer park in Montana. Both parents working multiple jobs and dealing with a lot of scarcity. There were times my brother and I still commiserate often on the number of consecutive days where our one meal was a box of Kraft mac and cheese. And so I think coming from that much scarcity, in retrospect, I can look back with a lot of empathy for how little energy my parents had to deal with two rambunctious boys and their emotional needs. I also have to admit that there was a lot of just like verbal and emotional abuse to get super real about it. To be very clear, I've repaired my relationship with my parents. And my dad even a couple of times has really opened up to a heart-to-heart conversation about how he regrets how he treated my brother and I and stuff, which is really cool and just a really, really nice piece of repair to do. But there was a lot of, despite them doing the best they could with their limited resources, emotionally, materially, etc., I think that in such a scarce environment with so little energy to deal with emotional needs, my brother and I, when we had emotions that were different than what my parents were feeling or emotions that confronted them with something that needed their attention, something that needed to be dealt with, that was a problem. And so it was very much this like, oh, you're crying? Like, let me give you something to cry about. Like a lot of us, too many of us have heard that. So there was this really strange upbringing. Once I was a little more conscious of that, I think I was just out of the house as much as I could be. 12, 13, 14-year-old Zach was on a skateboard or a bike. Like I'd come home from school, do my homework, look, homework's done, see, all right, bye. I started to just avoid it if I could, right? And I wanted like quality time with these people because they're my family. And we would go have camping trips and it would be a great time. And we'd watch Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune together most nights and it would be a great time. So an interesting kind of mixed bag. Lots of like genuine love and affection with like this, you better be a certain kind of way or the love and affection won't be there. How conscious that was on my parents' part, probably not very, given their perspectives and such. So yeah, as a teenager, started to just not be around as much as I could. In those years, so from 2001 to 2006, my father was also deployed with the army, like post 9/11. Those 5 years, he was gone most of the time. So my stepmom was raising me pretty much on her own, and that was an interesting time as well, where I definitely need my dad around. I'm starting to go through puberty and stuff, and need some kind of masculine role model. And he's being a role model by going out, serving his country, completing his hero's journey, you might say. So I think that instilled in me fear of my own hero's journey, where I started to think, because of my own emotional needs often being treated like a problem, and this model of masculinity being this like really extreme version of a hero's journey where you might even have to abandon your family for some amount of time to go and complete yourself and serve. I had a really conflicted relationship with, well, not just with my dad, but with my own sense of purpose, where there was this fear of pursuing my purpose being a risk of losing people.
Two comments slash questions. So do you think maybe also there was a unconscious belief that maybe you not be able to live up to the model as a man that your father had established?
It's another thing I get to like revisit and reflect on. I appreciate that a lot because it was another point of conflict within me and I think within the family also, where I admired the shit out of my dad, not just for doing that, for serving his country, for keeping us all safe as we were assuming was the purpose, and all of that, and doing what he had to do, making those sacrifices. Right? He was also the guy who fixed the cars. The number of times we went to a mechanic was negligible because I think his first job in the army was as a mechanic, and he worked as a civilian mechanic and stuff for a while. Had worked in like carpentry and roofing, and so would just be the guy who's fixing everything around the house all the time too. And so just this like model of competent servitude was definitely something to live up to. And I think a lot of my early aspirations for how I wanted to live my life and even career ideas were based on that. Like I wanted to build custom cars for a while. I wanted to be a firefighter for a while. All of these like dad adjacent things.
Yeah.
And there was this messaging also from my stepmom as well as my mom that conflicted really deeply with that in terms of how he had treated them and therefore how I shouldn't be as a man. So I found, I think then, especially being raised primarily by my stepmom for a few years in those developmental years, I was able to really adopt the idea, this again Disney-fied idea of just being a Prince Charming who's like the ideal masculine model then is this guy who's competent, who's doing the competent servitude path in a way, but like for the women in his life, like not being dangerous and not like having needs. So
Chivalry and being a gentleman as the counterforce to this more brute, hyper masculine idea.
yeah, so it was a point of conflict that in some more subtle ways I continue to wrestle with. And so yeah, I think it was something to live up to and something to like avoid. Now that I've done all the inner work that I have and I get to have conversations like this and approach it really intentionally, I can kind of cherry pick from those two different approaches, right? Thankfully.
Yeah, I think my experience is very similar to yours. My dad was a construction worker, very Latino, masculine guy with traditional views, traditional ideas about how men should comport themselves. And me growing up, I was very sensitive and bookish. And I think there was this, and I think it exists in all men, regardless of personality, where you have this respect and need to be validated and to mirror your dad. You also have this underlying unconscious need to supersede and to rebel against the model that your dad has established. And so I think there was a lot of tension within me, and it sounds like within yourself as well, where you want to be like your dad, but you also understand how there are certain deficiencies and certain faults in the way that they are, that you try to move in the opposite direction. And I think for me, I also just moved in a direction that was too far away from what I thought my dad had, the avatar my dad was, and finding a balance between not being like your dad and seeing all of the faults and failures of a particular way of seeing how men should be, but then also not falling into the trap of just being a contrarian and just building your personality in negative terms. So yeah, very, very, very similar, I think, ways of wrestling with that tension and our fathers, right? And then the second thing I wanted to bring up was that this is the second time divorce has come up, because you told me you were raised in those formative years by your stepmother. Do you care to tell me a little bit more about your dad's and your mom's relationship or divorce or separation if they weren't married, and more about that situation?
So my parents, mom and dad, were divorced. I think I was 4 or 5. I remember being sat down on our old ratty couch in our trailer park in Montana and being told that that was happening, and being told that I was gonna, within the next year or so, move to California with my dad, and that my mom and my brother were gonna stay in Montana. And there's some weird logic to how that got split up, I suppose, because my brother and I have different dads. His dad wasn't in the picture, and my dad was always a very willing parent to him, but I guess how the split works, whatever their logic was at that point, they're like 30 and 25 and parenting two children together, so who knows what they were thinking, right? But before that, their relationship was volatile. I remember that some of my earliest memories are them disagreeing on the most basic things, like mom says, watch for cars before you cross the street, and dad's like, well, there's obviously no cars, what do you mean, you're being too careful, and then they're screaming at each other all of a sudden, and these sorts of things. And like if it ever happened in the trailer, the door to the bedroom would get closed, and then my brother and I could still hear everything, right? So there's like things being thrown. I don't think there was ever physical violence between them, but it was volatile, and so my brother and I found a lot of refuge in the outdoors. Some of my favorite like memories and images, as a side note, in Montana, like we would hike down to this little stream and either fish for these little like baby catfish down there, or put pennies on the railroad tracks and like wait for the train to come by and stretch them out, right? This is the most like American redneck shit you've ever heard in your life, right?
I've seen those pennies. I didn't know people actually. Yeah, that's impressive,
But
actually.
yeah, so some of my favorite, like safest, most like cherished images and memories from early childhood are that. But there's like a sad element to it where we were outside all the time because we were avoiding the volatility inside the house. And so they split up. I went to California with my dad a little bit thereafter and spent a few years bouncing back and forth because my parents, trying to do the right thing, were like, you can choose who you want to live with. So every like 6 to 12 months, of course, I miss my mom. So I'm like, yeah, I want to go back to Montana. And then I miss my dad. So yeah, I want to go back to California because I'm 6, 7, 8 years old, right? So like,
Yeah.
what the hell else am I gonna do? So that was turbulent. Made a lot of friends. Said goodbye to a lot of friends, and finally settled. Finally, just decided to stay in California. By the time I was like 10, I think, like 9 or 10, I had made some like really solid friends that were both in my neighborhood and that went to the same elementary school, so we could walk to school together. Fucking unheard of these days, right? Like fourth or fifth graders walking themselves to school. It was like a mile away. That's like so much danger in a mile, right? But yeah, I made two or three really good friends in the neighborhood, and we walked to school together every day. So at that point I was like, okay, this is where I want to stay. And my mom was already looking at getting work in California anyway. And then within a year or two, she did find some steady work in Sacramento. So then my mom and my brother were in Sacramento. And at this point, my stepmom's already in the picture. Like as soon as my dad moved to California, my stepmom was in the picture because they had already known each other from way back when. So like the timing of all that, who knows? But there's always been sort of like this tension and weird competition between my mom and stepmom too, for like the love and adoration of me and my brother, and who knows what their relationship to my dad is. But I think you were asking specifically about the dynamics of the divorce and their relationship and stuff. So after that, my dad and my mom didn't interact any more than they needed to, aside from pick up, drop off when like kids were visiting, when my brother and I were hanging out with one or the other. And of course, the occasional comments about how dumb or whatever the other one is, because they're still in their like early 30s and not mature enough to like withhold those sorts of things. And my dad and my stepmom's relationship was always pretty tense as well. I think there was like a lot of just unspoken tension and conflict that never got resolved. For all I know, probably still hasn't been resolved, because whereas my dad and mom were both like loud, volatile types of arguers, my stepmom is just like silent, seething rage. And so things just didn't get addressed. And when they did, it would blow up. And when it blew up, my dad, being the loudest, most aggressive in the house, would just dominate for a while and lecture everyone in a really loud voice for like 15, 20 minutes, and then the house would be silent for a couple hours. And that's one of the things that he has expressed very explicit regret for not like managing those situations better. And I'm like, you know what, Dad, I respect that. It damaged me and my brother, obviously, but like you're recognizing it, and good for you, man. That pretty much characterized the dynamic in that household.
What was your experience like in school?
Elementary and middle school, I was trying my best to get into trouble. I was the class clown. I was pulling pranks. I was maybe not trying to get into trouble, but trying to see how much I could get away with. And a lot of it was boredom with the overly structured sit down and listen to a teacher talk for an hour plus kind of format that our public education takes. And being a precocious boy with probable ADHD, or whether or not it really exists in my nervous system, I probably could have been diagnosed with ADHD. And they even tried to give my brother and I both meds back in the day. And thankfully, my parents resisted that because we were getting good grades. I was the guy, we were both those guys who were really pissing our teachers off because
Right.
all of the work we turned in was stellar and we wouldn't shut up in class. And I'm like shooting spitballs out of a straw at the back of people's heads and these sorts of things. So I was doing everything I could to entertain myself, I think. I needed a lot of attention and I knew how to get it. So I was doing that. Really enjoyed English class and science class. Any of these things where I could do a lot of like analytical thinking and writing and like synthesizing of information, that was always really stimulating for me. So I was in advanced classes for those. Math never worked for me until I took geometry, because then there's like a visual. I know why I'm crunching these numbers now, because I'm calculating an angle or a parabola or whatever.
Yeah.
And then
Azimuth.
the same later on with statistics too, where I know why I'm doing this algebra. Straight up algebra class almost failed. Yeah, I think the pattern continued into high school. I mellowed out a little bit because I knew there were larger ramifications for getting into actual trouble, where suspensions and stuff like that stay on your record, which go to universities. And I was like, oh, I probably want to go to college someday, so like, maybe not. But I still needed a lot of attention and still needed to be like entertaining myself in these ways. So the report cards looked the same, where I'm getting A's and B's and excessive socialization. But I was then involved in a lot of other stuff. I was playing baseball at the time. I joined leadership or student government. I was the guy that was doing the morning announcements, which was super fun. And I was in the show choir, which I had no experience with previously. A girl I had a crush on was just like, hey, join the show choir. And I was like, okay. I ended up doing that all through high school. I actually really loved it. So I was like really diving into anything that would make me everyone's friend, because I needed all of that attention and validation. Sophomore year, perhaps. No, I think it was summer between freshman and sophomore year, I discovered drugs. So then I'm living like this weird double life of like model student at school that everyone loves, can't do anything wrong, and like literally administrators are asking me to have a chat with some of my friends who are messing up in one way or another, right? Because I'm like that tight with the vice
Mm-hmm.
principals. And then as soon as school's out, I'm going and smoking as much weed as I can get my hands on, or like convincing somebody outside the 7-Eleven to give me a bottle of tequila so my friends and I can get trashed on a Wednesday. So then in retrospect, there was all of that attention and validation that I was getting in high school and like really good at it started to not be enough to like numb and avoid all of the inner turbulence that I didn't know how to address, because of course I'm a teenager, right? So I found some more direct and more potent ways of numbing and avoiding. That stuff carried through into college to a certain extent, and also allowed me, I think, to stay in the confines of those expectations for how to live my life that I was mentioning earlier, that kept me in that marriage for 9 years and stuff like that, even though my intuition was screaming at me the whole time.
Did you meet your ex-wife in high school or in college?
Right in between, actually. It was about a month after I graduated high school. Since I had been doing the show choir stuff and some musical theater productions, we were both asked to choreograph a musical. And that's how we met. It's like super meet cute, wholesome. The first rehearsal, I'm like, hey, so we're both choreographers. I should probably have your phone number. Uh, so that's how we met.
What are your political views?
The conservatism that I grew up with, I think, has only stuck with me in the sense that I have empathy for it. I don't think that everyone who voted for Trump, for example, is a bad person. I don't think that they're all racists. I don't think they're all deplorable, because I have this perspective on what makes people vote Republican. That already doesn't make me a lot of friends. I'm lucky that the people I love in my life, who are all very progressive, or most of whom are very progressive, know me well enough to like, they got to know me and love me before any of that happened, before 2016 happened.
Yeah.
Right. So so when I say that, they're like, ah, Zach just being a centrist again. But then we can still have a good time, and it's not a cause. I think the people in my inner circle are also reasonable enough to not necessarily want to associate with people who voted for Trump, but also more or less agree with me that they're not terrible people. So that, I think, might encapsulate a lot of my political views already. Like, when I talk about specific issues and go like point by point, to attach a label to all of those would be progressive. But it's like it's a moderate version of progressivism that's probably informed a little bit by like the quasi-libertarian stuff I grew up with, right? So like, I want there to be lots and lots of healthy, productive immigration, because I think that provides value to our country, and I think we can then provide value to those people who really desperately need it. And open borders makes no sense at all. And I don't know that anyone's actually advocating for open borders these days, but as an extreme, right? I think it's really important to hold these like middle positions. I think that's how I would summarize my political views, because I think not only are most of us somewhere in that kind of purple middle. I think of my super religious, God-fearing aunt who loves to shoot guns and is raising two like non-binary children and loves the shit out of them. And I think of my other like good friends from college, who are one guy I'm thinking of in particular runs his local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America and has a closet full of guns and loves to shoot them. So I think holding that middle position and making space for the nuance and the complexity of just being human, and allowing for us to not have to just subscribe wholesale to these rigid boxes of political identity. I think that's really important. That's where most of us are, and I think it is just more fair to life and existence itself, where it just means that I don't have to put myself in a box, and I don't have to put you in a box.
To use that word again, balance. And I think keeping your labels to a minimum and keeping your identity small, and understanding that, we contain multitudes, we are complex, there's nuance in things, and we cannot be contained in a box, in one label. The ideas that at a particular moment, historical moment, encapsulate a particular party or a particular ideology don't necessarily capture its history, don't necessarily capture the connections within. I lived in the Bay Area, and I knew one guy in particular, but many others who were either anarchists or anarchist adjacent, and the differences between anarchism and libertarianism are a lot, but then there's a lot of overlap as well. And so it's very easy to move from left anarchism to classical liberalism, which is very much similar to what we now consider, mainline libertarianism. Mm-hmm. And within those three sort of traditions, or within those sort of flavored ideas of anti-state political views, one finds many differences. One finds many different ways of approaching individuals, larger groups, etc. And so it's a matter of being intelligent, thinking through things, the implications, etc. But labels and boxes make it easier for people to just create for themselves ready-made, easy identities, so that they don't have to put in the work that is necessary to fully understand politics, history, and societies. And even for someone such as myself, I'm not that intelligent. I'm just curious, and I read a lot. And so I could see how it's way more difficult to come up with a particular answer to any large group action or collective action problem.
And I think the way that we do that is by making sure that people who disagree can have a conversation. And those boxes that you're talking about that make it easy for me to just adopt this identity and not put more thought into it also make it really easy for me to other and to create these ready-made us versus them dynamics. And that prevents the conversation. So to make any of these really important decisions on behalf of an entire nation, let alone a state or even a county full of hundreds of thousands of people, we need to be able to have a conversation. And people who think differently need to be able to, in good faith, attempt to understand each other.
I've been beating that drum for the past 4 years, and I came to the realization that it wasn't healthy for anyone to just have this confrontational us versus them mindset when dealing with individuals. So I agree
Right.
with you wholeheartedly and completely that it should be a matter of being able to accept and engage with others and being secure in your beliefs and your ideas because of all the work you've put into developing them, but also understanding that you are fallible, that you're not this sort
Mhm.
of godlike figure who cannot be mistaken and who should also be open to changing one's
100%.
mind. And if
I
you're able
think
to do that, I think that goes a long way in political conversations, but also with conversations around all of the hard, complex things that life
Man,
brings.
I love that so much. And it reminds me of this axiom from athletic training in various disciplines that flexibility is strength. So to be secure in what you believe and what your values are doesn't necessarily mean that they're always the same. And I think it indicates a lot of confidence and security and strength, let alone intelligence, to have the mental flexibility to adapt your perspective as you gain more information. I mean,
Mhm.
we're teaching algorithms to do this for us in machine learning, but we're not bothering to do it in our own internal operating systems, right? So I think to be able to change my mind is actually a sign of strength and maturity and not a sign of weakness.